Hey BookTube, it's Kim at Middle of the Book March. This is the second time I'm trying to create this video because I don't typically do individual book reviews, but I could not stop myself from reviewing Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. I have the physical book right here, but instead of holding it up for the entire time I'm talking, I'm just going to insert a picture. I read Blood Meridian with AJ Dunn from AJ Dunn Reads and Writes as a buddy read the first 4 days in June. We just sped right through it, and it was an awesome buddy read. We had a great conversation. We basically just started to talk whenever the thought or moment hit us, and I just love talking to them because we bounced ideas back and forth, and we bounced imagery and writing style, and I had a great time. AJ, thank you. I had a great time in that conversation. It was a wonderful collaboration. I really felt that, and I had a blast. Thank you so much. So, Blood Meridian. This has been on my shelf for years. I've been avoiding it because of the obvious reasons of its reviews and analyses of the violence contained in the book. Cormac McCarthy is known for writing books that are extremely violent and barbaric, and has been called one of the greatest American writers, the greatest American writer of the 20th century, the greatest living American writer. McCarthy is 88 years old. He lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he is a novelist who writes of the West and writes novels that are called anti-Westerns. There's always some theme or tone or content having to do with violence of men, set in the West, set in the Southwest, and let's talk about Blood Meridian, and you'll see kind of the similarities between his other books. The book is set in the 1850s in the South on the Texas-Mexican border and going into the Southwest of the country. It is during the time of Manifest Destiny, where white people thought they had the rights to all the land, and they were basically periodically and systematically murdering American Indians, Native Americans. Throughout the novel, they are called Indians. And so white people were committing genocide against Native Americans. And the Mexican government hired the Glanton Gang, which is based on a real-life gang of killers and murderers, mercenaries, criminals, depraved individuals, who were hired out to kill and scalp Indians throughout the South. Glanton is a real character in history. And at first we believe he is the leader of the Glanton Gang, but I'll get further into that in a few minutes. Our main protagonist is called the Kid. We never hear a name. In the beginning of the book, he's 14 years old, and he has left home in Tennessee with no thoughts of going back. He gets into violent situations. He is shot and wounded. He needs to be nursed back to health. And once he's healthy enough and can walk, he leaves. He ends up falling in with a bunch of different people, gets into, again, fights and violence, and is eventually recruited by the Glanton Gang to join their band of murderers to travel the South in search of scalps, to trade in for money, purely out of greedy motives. And so once he joins the Glanton Gang, we have several different characters that are throughout the novel. The Kid, the ex-priest, Toadvine, Captain Glanton, and one of the most notorious characters in literature, the Judge, or Judge Holden. This book is the story of depravity, the story of constant and senseless violence, violence for no reason, war, sadism, the status of men's hearts as being soulless and hopeless and black and dark and irredeemable. There's so much biblical imagery throughout the novel, and I want to talk a little bit about what I think the message is in this book and what I think the biblical images and imagery and metaphors and allegories are. Very early, I'm going to read a quote. I'm going to read two quotes, and the first one is very important. It's page 20 of my paperback. And it says, he can know his heart, but he don't want to. Rightly so. Best not to look in there. It ain't the heart of a creature that is bound in the way that God has set for it. So clearly somebody believes that there was a God that had a purpose for mankind, that had something in mind for how he wanted perfect beings that God created, that he created to act and to live. And quite obviously, human men do not live that way. And their hearts are too frightening to look at with any great magnifying lens. And so there's that nihilistic property throughout the novel. Life is meaningless. There is no hope. What's the point? There is no God. It's all shit. There's no reason for living. I may as well just succumb to the depravity in my own heart and live in that respect. Throughout the novel, McCarthy writes images of fire and burning and heat, and the haze of heat pouring out of the ground, the dryness, the cracked earth, lava, volcanoes, fires in the distance. So if you can imagine this band of murderers riding on desiccated horses, searching out water, searching out food, across a bleak landscape of heat and dryness and death, something that is not appropriate for man to live in. That is the imagery throughout the novel. And when he's discussing fire, and he writes images of fires and things burning, and they would be burning dead bodies. They would be making fires to cook animals and to have roasts, and at times to dance around fires. Another Bible imagery there was a place called Gehenna. And in the Bible, Gehenna was described as basically an eternally burning garbage dump. And in the time of Jesus in the New Testament, that is what was believed to be the metaphor for hell. The fires that never went out, the heat and the disgust and the bleakness, the depravity. And so that's where we get the picture of hell. And McCarthy in this book is so spectacular at writing those images, at describing the landscape, describing the atmosphere, writing the setting so that the atmosphere and the landscape are its own characters, along with the violence, which is almost a character in itself. And it's very difficult to read this book and be able to accept one act of depravity after another, one act of brutalism and horror, one act of gore and murder and killing and raping and pillaging. It's difficult to read over and over and over again. And I started to wonder, why is he constantly describing the most horrifying, heinous acts of violence and murder? Eventually, it's easy for the reader to be desensitized to all the senselessness, the senseless acts of violence. And I think that's part of his point, and that's part of the written image of all of these events, is to desensitize the reader, just like is happening with the characters in the story. The more murder they commit, the more bloodlust develops, and the deeper they fall into this pit of despair and evil. And there is no getting out of it. There is no clawing their way out. There is no moral compass. There is no sense of shame. There is no sense of empathy for humanity. It's what humanity can perpetrate against humanity. And I think that's part of McCarthy's point, is that with one act of bloodlust after another, eventually it becomes no more a motivation than a rush, the continued rush and the hopelessness of the world, of life, of existence. So if there's no point of life, there's no hope for humanity, why not? Why not commit whatever barbarous acts I feel like committing? Because that's the only time I feel anything. That's the only time I feel alive. And that's kind of me imagining what these characters are going through internally, because there is no internal glimpse into any of them, into their minds or their hearts. It's just the reader imagining what must they be thinking, what must be going through their heads. So one of the major characters in the book and the primary antagonist is Judge Holden, or the Judge. He is described as this giant, white, hairless man, quite often naked, quite often completely not quite often, always completely shameless, oblivious and constantly noticing his surroundings at the same time. He simply does not care what his image is, and he simply does not care how the world sees him. He has been described as having albinism, no hair on any part of his body. The girth and the height and the presence of this man is frightening. And the entire group that he's with looks to him as kind of the model of barbarism, the model of nihilism. And it's thought through most of the novel that he is kind of second in command to Captain Glanton, who is quite a stupendous murderer in his own right. But as we read further, we start to realize that the Judge is actually more of a presence and more of a motivator for Captain Glanton than the other way around. And so we start to wonder, who's the Judge and what kind of a person is he? How did he end up there? Why is he there? And at one point, the kid is asking the ex-priest, who is another character, what is he a judge of? And the ex-priest is kind of chilled and said, oh, don't question it. I'm paraphrasing, but don't question that. He just is. And that's a foreshadowing of what we find out later in the novel. We always wonder, where did the Judge come from? Because when he speaks in lectures and he speaks in long, rambling speeches, highly intelligent. He documents things in a little book, and he draws in this book. And to his group of men who follow in the gang, he seems very articulate and very well spoken and almost legal or lawyer-ish. But it's a constant question, who is he? Or, more appropriate, what is he? And so throughout the novel, there is so much imagery of the end of the world, or an apocalypse. And very many reviewers describe this book as an apocalyptic novel. And yes, but I think it's more appropriate to describe it as an allegory for Armageddon, for the biblical Armageddon of a very basic good versus evil. The only problem with that is it's inaccurate, because in this novel there is no good. It's quite simply evil versus evil, and it's man against man, whether it's Native Americans against white men, or Mexican men against white men, or Mexican men against Native men. It's just man against man. And another one of the most important passages in the book, in my opinion, and also one of the shortest, but that very short part I'm gonna save in a minute, but I'm gonna kind of preface it with this. The Judge smiled. Men are born for games, nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows, too, that the worth or merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put at hazard. Games of change require a wager to have meaning at all. Games of sport involve the skill and strength of the opponents, and the humiliation of defeat and the pride of victory are in themselves sufficient stake, because they inhere in the worth of the principles and define them. But trial of chance or trial of worth, all games aspire to the condition of war, for here that which is wagered swallows up game, player and all. That's the Judge speaking, and further on, the very short sentence, and one of the most important in the novel, says, war is God. And that is the state of men's hearts. Men are bred for war. Inherent in men is built the taste for war, that bloodlust. And I think that's one of the most important images in Blood Meridian, is that with all of the violence, war causes the violence, and violence encourages war to continue. And it's that cycle, and it's the inherent nature of man to enjoy war, to seek it out. And I think that's part of what McCarthy is saying in this novel, is, again, the nihilism of life is meaningless, the world is meaningless, we can fight. War is God, and God is war. The judge plays a huge part at the end of the novel, and I debated whether to put spoilers in the video, but I think I'm going to not do that. If you've read the book and would love to discuss it, I am more than willing and would welcome the opportunity to have more conversation about Blood Meridian. So if you want to talk about the end of the book or the themes and the images in the novel, I would love to do that. So let me know in the comments below. But ultimately, the judge, can we believe that he is actually symbolic of God as judge? Does God exist in this novel? Personally, I don't believe he does. Who is the judge, and what is he the judge of? He says of himself, I will never die. I will always dance, and I will never die. In a Christian sense, there are two beings that is true for, until we get to Armageddon, and that is either God or Satan. So it's either good or evil. And as I said before, this book contains no good. It's just evil, man against man. So we can kind of assume who the judge is and who he reveals himself to be by the end of the novel. There is so much foreshadowing and foreboding as the novel builds to the end. And the end is very ambiguous. There's no bow that is wrapped up around this story, and there is no cowboys riding off into the sunset with a the end. It is wide open. What the hell did I just read? What does this mean? That's all the reader is thinking. And this novel is compared to Dante's Inferno, to Moby Dick, to Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. So there's a lot of comparisons to those novels that highly and at length discuss the state of men's hearts, the status of their souls. Do they have souls, or are they just hungry for war and violence? Why? Again, I ask. At the end of the book, I started to question, what kind of guy writes this type of a novel? It's the desensitization to the violence. It happens to the reader. It's in the mind of Cormac McCarthy, and it obviously continues through each character in this book. The irony of reading Blood Meridian is absolutely loving the writing. His writing is spectacular. He is a master at setting, atmosphere, landscape. He describes the characters without ever getting into their internal monologue or their internal motivations. And he describes them by their actions. He propels the story by the events that happen. There are long passages of him describing these people riding on horses, looking for water, finding a town, riding through the heat and the desert. There's a lot of that. It starts to get a little repetitive until I kind of talked myself down and sat and thought about that for a minute. That's what he wants you to read. That's what he wants you to feel. The man hates commas. There are similes throughout the novel, which is one of my biggest pet peeves as a reader. But eventually it got to the point where I wasn't even noticing the similes, like this and like that. Normally I hate that, but in this book they dropped off. I didn't even notice. His wording, his choice of words, the sparsity of his language, the descriptive words, it's just magnificent. So, those are my thoughts on Blood Meridian. That's it for me for this review. I hope it wasn't too rambly. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.